Well, welcome to our second episode of An Achievable Dream, entitled A Practical Approach to Weather Routing. We want to thank you for joining us and hope you find this episode helpful. Since completing episode 1, we have moved 1,000 miles further north and have taken Oasis from the Washington-Canadian border up to Alaska, which is where we spent the last half of the winter. It is now early April, and although it is officially spring for most of the lower 48, we are still having snow each day, with temperatures ranging from the low 20s at night to the 30s during the day. Spring does actually come to Alaska, it just takes a little longer. In February, when we left for Alaska, we had only 10 hours of daylight each day. 2 months later, we are now up to 15 hours of daylight per day, and in another few months it will be 22 hours per day. So everything is moving in the right direction, and the forecast shows 20 degrees warmer weather next week. Back in episode 1, we discussed the routing and harbor options for making the 1,100-mile offshore passage from Southern California up along the California, Oregon, and Washington coast, then into the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and ending up in Vancouver, British Columbia. What we did not discuss is what it takes to make this journey in a safe, professional, and responsible manner. The two vitally important aspects of safely executing this or any other long offshore passage is good weather routing and vessel preparedness. In this episode, part 1 of episode 2, we will discuss the basics of weather routing, and in part 2 of episode 2, we will review some of the steps you can take to help ensure that you and your boat are fully operational and prepared to go to sea. In early February, we departed Washington State on Oasis to head up to Alaska. We have received a lot of questions as to how we were able to make the passage through Canada to get to Alaska, with the border having been closed due to the coronavirus. Although the Canadian border is officially closed, we were able to get permission from Canada's Border Authority to transit through Canadian waters, so long as we agreed not to go ashore or detour from taking the most direct route to Alaska. So more on this in episode 3, which will cover the beautiful Inside Passage from Washington to Juneau, Alaska. For safety reasons, due to all the logs and debris, we try only to transit during daylight hours, which, given that we were still in winter, limited us to about 10 hours or approximately 95 miles per day. Our trip ended up taking us 6 days, traveling 10 hours a day, since the days are short in February. And we were able to make it to Ketchikan, where we arrived just after dark 6 days later. Winter weather can be tough at these latitudes, and gale force winds are the rule rather than the exception. This gave us a lot of time to think about the weather challenges of getting the boat to Alaska, and more importantly, for what weather parameters we wanted to set for ourselves when it came to making what will be our 11th crossing of the Gulf of Alaska. So this seemed like the perfect example to use to illustrate a practical approach to weather routing, which is what we are going to cover now in this episode. I can certainly appreciate that you may not find this episode to be your favorite topic, and although I recognize that it is not particularly engaging or intriguing, it is perhaps the single most important episode we will cover in this entire series. For those who aren't experienced with making extended offshore passages, let me just say weather is everything when it comes to offshore passage making, and understanding weather forecasting might very well save your ship and indeed your life. In any endeavor, there are always lots of unpleasant or less pleasant tasks which we need to manage and need to be dealt with. It is no different when it comes to living on board a yacht or passage making. Dealing with challenging decisions, making repairs, and maintenance items are weekly, if not daily, events on board a yacht. Many of these may not be to our liking, but as a captain, this cannot be allowed to diminish, distract, or impact their being addressed and dealt with. It took me years to learn that liking or disliking a particular chore is irrelevant when it comes to the proper operation, safety, and/or maintenance of a vessel. If something needs doing, do it now. Weather routing is 100% mission critical and the single most vitally important step you can take to ensure the safety of your crew and the boat. You literally skip this step at your own peril. It used to be that to understand meteorology meant you had to wear black-rimmed glasses, you wore a white short-sleeved shirt. So those days are long gone, and looking at weather has become far easier on the eyes. You no longer need to hold a degree in meteorology to understand occluded and stationary fronts, or, if you could ever read them at all, which way to turn the weather map so at least you are looking at it right side up. Today, it has become all too easy to gain access to multiple sets of weather data, which have already been parsed, analyzed, and interpreted for you. The hard work has already been done. All you have to do is to invest the time to get familiar with whatever user interface you feel most comfortable with, to develop your skills, methodology, and refine the process in a way that works for you. Like it or not, one way or the other, you are going to be embracing weather and forced to make difficult choices. For perspective, we can spend anywhere from 15 minutes to well over 20 hours planning, coordinating, and cross-checking to make sure that we understand the boat and what the crew might be facing before we leave port. I could fill an entire episode with mistakes, miscalculations, misadventures, and disasters that have befallen those who got impatient and/or unwilling to embrace the saying that he who fights and runs away lives to fight again another day. When it comes to trip planning and weather routing, predetermining the outcome and rigidity are both killers. Last Thursday, an Alaskan flight came up from Seattle. They got to within 40 miles of the Juneau airport. The weather closed in around them. They thought better of it. They turned around and flew all the way back to Seattle. Our passengers and guests expect the same level of discipline and professionalism from us as they do from their airline pilots. What really drove this point home for me was around the time of taking Oasis on her first trip to Europe. We had just received word that the motor yacht Nadine, a Dutch-built 166-foot luxury yacht weighing just over 500,000 pounds, had been lost on what should have been a routine 85-mile, 6-hour run from Civitavecchia near Rome to the Isle of Sardinia. Stories like these are always painful to recount, but it had a profound impact on my life, and I think it's worth sharing. Nadine, which was originally built for Coco Chanel, had a new owner who, with his family, was flying into Rome on their private jet, excited about their planned holiday trip to Sardinia. Captain Doug, an experienced and professional captain, met the family at the airport early in the morning. On their drive back to Nadine, Doug cautioned the owner that it might be a bit of a bumpy ride, and perhaps they should push the trip back 24 hours, when conditions were expected to improve, and leave out the following morning. However, the owner had a golf game scheduled for the following morning, and owning a mega yacht like Nadine failed to comprehend or appreciate the captain's concerns. Feeling uneasy about making the voyage, but wanting to please his boss, Doug departed the harbor at 11 o'clock that same morning. Weather conditions on the morning of their departure, although less than ideal, were certainly acceptable. There had been some low-level chatter about a possible mistral developing later in the day, but Doug concluded that so long as Nadine maintained her normal cruising speed of 15 or 16 knots in the 4 to 6 foot seas, he would have them safely in Sardinia in time for cocktails on the back deck, followed by their 5-course dinner. 3 hours after their departure, around 2 in the afternoon, gale warnings were posted along the entire Italian coast. Nadine was now halfway to Sardinia. The seas, which had been 4 to 6 feet, were now looking more like 6 to 9 feet, and the wind had increased from 25 knots. Doug realized that if he pushed on, he was going to have to reduce speed to under 10 knots. He gave some thought to turning around, but felt that the boat could make it, and he certainly didn't want to disappoint the owner. 2 hours later, around 4 in the afternoon, the winds were now gale force and well over 30 knots. Seas were running at 12 to 15 feet, and Nadine was now only making 7 knots over the ground. A half hour later, at 4:30 p.m., the tow line parted to their $250,000 33-foot Intrepid tender. There was no way to turn the ship around to retrieve her. The tender was no longer Doug's primary focus, which was the right call, and it would have to be considered a write-off. By 5 p.m., the winds and seas were continuing to build to the point that he had cut his speed to 3 to 4 knots, just enough to maintain minimum steerage weight. This routine 6-hour crossing had now evolved into a 21-hour nightmare. Doug thought if he could just hold on till midnight, they would be in the lee of Sardinia and would certainly get some relief. Shortly thereafter, a rogue wave crashed over the bow, tearing off the hatch to the crew's forward scuttle. Within minutes, the forward compartment flooded. Fortunately for them, the watertight bulkhead was holding. However, Nadine now was down at the bow, which lifted her stern, and steerage was becoming sluggish. By 6 p.m., sustained winds had climbed to 60 knots with gusts to 70, and the waves were topping 30 or 35 feet. Virtually everything on the foredeck had been washed off. The teak cap rails were splintering, and piece by piece the sea was dismantling Nadine. By midnight, the winds hit hurricane strength with even higher seas. Doug suspected that it was game over for Nadine and had the presence of mind to recognize that he needed to evacuate the owner, his family, and the crew. He also knew that in these conditions, no rescue would be possible until dawn the following morning. Shortly after midnight, Doug made a mayday call to the Italian Coast Guard, who promised to dispatch a rescue helicopter at 5 a.m. the following morning. Doug had to keep Nadine afloat until the rescue team would arrive. At 4:30 a.m., the crew pushed Nadine's helicopter over the side of the ship so that the rescue helicopter could safely lift the passengers and crew off the flight deck of the stricken vessel. By 6 o'clock this following morning, everyone had been airlifted off the Nadine, and she sunk shortly thereafter. All that remained of Nadine was her 33-foot Intrepid, which was found the following day in perfect condition on a beach. Here are my 5 takeaways that I learned from reading this account. First, Doug should have trusted his initial instincts and resisted the temptation to please his boss while second-guessing himself. Next, always increase the forecasted wind speeds and sea state by 33%. Did I just say that again? Let me say it a third time. Always increase the forecast wind speed and sea heights by 33%. Understand your ship and your crew's capability, endurance, and preparedness. And perhaps also remember that boat owners and guests, although well-meaning, are most often not knowledgeable or experienced boaters. As captain, you are responsible for your crew and the boat. Prioritizing guests' arrivals, departures, reservations, or golf games will only ensure that you make mistakes and poor decisions. No matter the class, standard, certification, or rating of your boat, to whatever standard it was built to, or how prepared, competent, and skilled you are, anything less than 25,000 tons and 800 feet is a bathtub toy when it comes to the power of the ocean. I could fill yet another entire episode with stories and anecdotes from owners and captains who thought they owned a bulletproof battleship, as did everyone on the White Star Line when the Titanic sank. Along with sound navigation and good maintenance practices, weather, sea state warnings such as small craft advisories, gale, storm, and hurricane warnings, and currents are the most vitally important consideration to safe boating. This point cannot be overstated. The further offshore you venture, the greater the distance between safe harbors, the more remote the locations, the more extreme the latitudes, the more critical that weather forecasting will have on the outcome of your experience. Your primary responsibility is for the safety of your passengers and the ship. So here are two guiding principles that have served us well. First, always assume that you are a paid captain and ask yourself what decision you would make if the owner was on board. Second, trust your initial instincts. If you are unsure or think that conditions are less than ideal and you care about your passengers and/or your boat's well-being, then you have your answer. It likely is not safe. It is far better to miss the lead story than to become the lead story. Each captain will have their own unique experiences, pain threshold, limitations, and methodology when it comes to how they approach weather routing. Mine is set to the comfort level of the weakest guest or crew member on board the boat, which is currently our dog, Serena. As mentioned earlier, it is important to recognize that modern forecasting isn't the same as it was a generation ago. Today's forecasts are now produced with the aid of satellite data, buoy telemetry, live on-scene ship reports, and supercomputers, making them remarkably accurate. 9 times out of 10, if a boat gets caught in rough weather, it'll be due to pilot error. Generally speaking, the first 5 days of weather forecast will have an accuracy rate approaching 90%. The next 2 days are about 80% accurate. Between 30 and 60 degrees north latitude, we would consider a 7-day forecast to provide actionable weather information. By day 10, the forecast is still generally above 65% accurate, mostly due to just timing and movement discrepancies in each model. And they remain greater than 50% accurate out the full 14-day period. When you stop and think about it, this is a remarkable advancement in meteorology and weather routing. Here are 7 items which need to be considered before you start to look at weather. How many nautical miles is the offshore portion of the journey? Under normal sea conditions, what is your average cruising speed? Are there any currents to be taken into account? What is the distance between safe harbors or anchorages? How many hours are required for the passage and between safe harbors? Before looking at weather, you need to establish what sea conditions you, your crew, and your boat will find acceptable. Of equal and perhaps even greater importance, you need to realistically consider what sea conditions you and your boat can tolerate, assuming that you have a mechanical breakdown, lose steerage, you have to fight a fire, or that you're taking on water. As a good exercise, next time you are out at sea on your boat, try doing an experiment. Put your boat in neutral to simulate what the conditions would be like on your boat if you lost propulsion. Virtually all boats, after a few minutes, will end up lying with their beam to the swells. Take into account the extent to which your boat relies on active stabilizers and/or forward propulsion for stabilization. This is invaluable in helping guide your final decision as to what weather is and is not tolerable. And finally, plot weather forecasts at not greater than a 12-hour interval. Oasis is a very heavy trawler, weighing 135 tons with a 10-foot draft. We have done about 175,000 sea miles on Oasis, and we have reached the point in our cruising where we have learned that if boating is going to have a future for us, it has to be a good experience for everyone. That means low stress on the crew, on the boat, and especially on our golden retriever, Serena. Essentially, our job as captain is to make sure everyone has a good experience, to not take unnecessary risks, and to avoid making a major mistake. So each captain has to make their own assessment, but it bears mentioning again that there are no number of good experiences that will erase or reverse one bad experience. Each of us has seen this tragedy unfold countless times, and it almost always ends the same way, either in divorce, separation, or the boat being put up for sale. Our upcoming trip across the Gulf of Alaska will be our working example. So let's run through how we approach weather routing. Here is our intended offshore passage, which measures 350 nautical miles. We run at 1550 RPM, producing a speed through calm seas with light winds of 9.5 knots. Therefore, to be conservative, we are going to use a speed of 9.2 knots. There are currents in the Gulf this time of year, which will be about a quarter of a knot going with us. Since we can't always count on these currents, we will still use 9.2 knots in our weather routing calculations, which comes out to 38 hours of transit time, 350 miles divided by 9.2 knots. I'm going to set up 3 weather points for this trip, each at about a 12-hour interval, plus an additional 4th point at the time period 0, which will be our departure. If we were rounding any significant capes, we would add those weather points as well. Here is how our trip lays out. We only have 2 escape points during the first 40% of this trip, and each of these are about 45 to 50 miles from our intended course line, or about 5 or 6 hours in calm conditions, but that could easily turn into 12 hours in bad weather. So this is all to say that we are going to be extra cautious in selecting our weather window. Our criteria for this trip, given the time of year, extreme latitude, and geographic remoteness, are ultra conservative. Here are our parameters for this trip. Forecast head seas forward of the beam of less than 5 feet and a minimum wave period of 2.5 to 1. Forecast headwinds of less than 15 knots, forecast following seas of less than 6.5 feet with a minimum wave period of 1.5 to 1, and forecast following winds abaft our beam at less than 22 knots. In recent years, we tend to use Predict Wind Offshore, which is a paid subscription service at somewhere around $30 per year. I'm sure there are several equally good sites, but we like the ability to see 4 different weather models on one site, which Predict Wind Offshore offers. We have successfully used this site for about 10 years and have found it to be accurate, reliable, and we are both familiar and comfortable with their graphical interface. As you can see, I've marked our intended route on the map from the red dot at the western edge of Icy Straits for the crossing of the Gulf of Alaska to Prince William Sound. The first waypoint is just off the southern tip of Kayak Island, and the second is at the entrance to Prince William Sound at Cape Hinchinbrook. Next, you will need to draw a white box indicating the geographic boundaries of your search area. The first step is to click on the green download button, which opens the download settings. By default, we have all the boxes checked except for Cape, and we want to see all the weather models at 3-hour intervals for the full 14 days and at a resolution of 50 kilometers. Then click Next. Set your start time to now. Select Color Imagery. Then select Next again. On this page, select Download All, and depending on your internet speed, it may take a minute for the files to download and display. When all the models have finished downloading, select Close, and you're done with collecting the weather data. After the page populates, you can zoom in and recenter the image to where you see your route with a 100 to 200 mile margin. we have shown our route with a white line to make it easier to follow along. The color-coded legend below the weather display gives you wave height in meters when set to wave and wind speed in knots when set to wind. The next line down is the timeline. All models will be 14 days except for the ECMWF model, which is limited to 10 days. By sliding the blue dot on the timeline, you can quickly view the weather forecast across the full 14 days. Alternatively, you can select the play icon and it will automate the display. We typically do not use that feature, but for purposes of this video, it seems helpful. I like to start by looking at the wave models over the next 14 days to see if and when we can identify a weather opening. In this example, if everything goes as planned, we need a 38-hour window for the crossing. To provide a margin of safety at both ends, we would use 48 hours as our minimum acceptable weather window. We are scanning for the subset of purple, dark and light blue in terms of wave height, and for either beam or following seas. If the waves are too high and/or moving in the wrong direction, there is no reason to slow down and spend more time on this section of the model. So let's get started. We will start with the PWG model set to wave. We see that PWG is forecasting a good opening starting early Saturday morning through Monday night. There is a second opening 1 week out on Wednesday morning to Friday morning, so that is 7 to 9 days out, and a possible third opening starting a week from Monday night, but it doesn't appear to be long enough before the weather window starts to close at Cape Hinchinbrook. Also, in terms of accuracy, keep in mind that the further out the forecast goes, the accuracy degrades. Going back over the forecast again, I will note that this coming Saturday through Sunday looks ideal, and since it is within 5 days, it is somewhere around 80 to 90% accurate. Next, we will do the same thing with the PWE model for wave. PWE shows a 96-hour weather opening starting midday on Saturday through Wednesday morning. However, they don't show the second opening that we saw on PWG for a week from Wednesday, and the third weather opening starting a week from Monday appears to only last 24 hours, so that it is not worth considering at this time. We now have two forecast models in agreement that there appears to be a viable weather opening that meets our predetermined criteria for this coming weekend. Our third wave model is the ECMWF, which has a 72-hour weather opening starting on Saturday afternoon through midday on Tuesday, with another possible opening in 9 days, but the second opening again only lasts about 24 hours, so we'll disregard this. This is great. We now have 3 wave models indicating that we have an excellent weather opening in terms of wave height and direction starting this coming weekend. Much like hurricane models, you should not expect to get all these models to come into alignment when you are looking out more than 2 or 3 days. Seeing 3 out of 3 models showing a possible weather opening this coming weekend is encouraging. So now let's go through these same models again to look at wind speed and direction and to make sure they're lining up with the wave forecast as well as our predetermined criteria for wind. Although the order is not important, we will start with PWG set to wind. This model suggests that winds off Icy Strait will start to moderate on Sunday morning, with winds turning to light across the Gulf for the following 48 hours. I'm not excited to start our trip with a forecast of 20-knot winds, which we will interpret as having gusts to 30 knots, even if they are following winds, but this may still change over the next 4 days. I also see that we are moving into improving conditions and that even if the winds are a bit strong on Sunday morning, they are following winds and our intended course would take us north of this wind stream within a couple of hours of departure. The winds for the remainder of the 2 weeks don't look favorable in terms of the wind direction or duration. Over the next 2 weeks, this weekend still looks like our best option. Next, we'll repeat this exact same process with the PWE model. Their forecast is remarkably similar to PWG, including that the winds do not appear favorable for the remainder of the forecast period for a crossing after this coming Tuesday. Looking at the GFS wind model, they are showing ideal conditions for a departure on either Saturday or Sunday from icy straits, which would help to minimize the concerns raised by the PWG and PWE models. However, off Kayak Island, 24 hours after our departure from icy straits, they are showing headwinds of 15 to 20 knots. This is a potential red flag, especially when you increase those forecast wind speeds by 33%. We will note that their wind forecast for the following week, out 8 to 10 days, looks favorable and is a possible plan B. In terms of our scorecard, we now have 3 favorable wave models and 2 of our 3 wind models indicating a possible go for this weekend. Finally, we will look at the ECMWF for wind. This model is considered to have an equal or greater historical accuracy compared with the GFS model when it comes to predicting wind direction and intensity. This model confirms GFS's prediction for light winds off icy straits for a Sunday morning departure and shows only 10 knots of headwinds off Kayak Island 24 hours later on Monday morning. The score is now 6 models for go, and just the GFS model is causing us some concern off Kayak Island for Monday morning. This new GFS model uses unbelievable state-of-the-art supercomputers, which cost a staggering $100 million. They now can make 8 quadrillion calculations per second and are in beta test for providing accurate forecasts up to 30 days in 2022. We consider both the ECMWF and GFS models to be the gold standard to use for weather routing. With a little practice, this process will take you 5 to 10 minutes. If you don't see a realistic probability of a weather opening, you are done for a day or two. If you are seeing a possible weather opening, like we do for this coming weekend, then we can go to the next step. When we are within 7 days of a possible weather opening, we can start to introduce a more refined, location-specific and nuanced weather forecasting site, like those offered by Buoy Weather. Over the last 8 years, we have been impressed with the consistency and high degree of location accuracy this site provides. We also like their interface, and now we can pick up one super important missing ingredient necessary to gain a clear picture of the weather, namely the wave period. Unlike PredictWind Offshore, Buoy Weather is location specific. To the extent possible, our goal is to now see how we can optimize our weather at each point along our route. To accomplish this, we break our weather forecasting into not more than 12-hour or 120-mile segments, so we can see what our weather forecast will look like around the time we expect to be in that vicinity. Here is how we would start to devise our actual transit schedule. We start by looking at what PredictWind Offshore's GFS model indicated might be the most problematic area. In this case, that was specifically off Kayak Island, where the GFS forecast indicated 15 to 20 knots of headwinds. Looking at the buoy weather modeling, the best time to arrive at Kayak Island is going to be Monday morning, when their forecast calls for light winds and seas to be 3 to 4 feet at 19 seconds from behind us. Kayak Island is 24 hours from our departure point at Icy Straits, so if we are going to target our arrival at Kayak Island mid-morning on Monday, we need to depart Icy Straits early Sunday morning. Here you can see that the forecast for light winds and seas around 3 to 4 feet at 9 seconds, which is within our predetermined parameters of having a wave period to wave height of 2 to 1. So this is a go. Next, we'll check the midpoint, halfway between Icy Straits and Kayak Island, just south of Yakutat. This will be 12 hours after our Sunday morning departure, which puts us off Yakutat at Sunday night. This forecast looks great, with light winds of 6 to 10 knots and seas of 4 to 5 feet at 12 to 19 seconds. This is essentially flat, calm conditions. Finally, we need to look at weather for our arrival into Prince William Sound. Assuming we leave Icy Straits around 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, our ETA at Cape Hinchinbrook should be about 38 hours later or just before dark on Monday evening. This forecast also appears close to ideal, with wind speeds of 8 to 12 knots from behind us and seas of 3 to 5 feet at 19 seconds. You have now spent 5 to 10 minutes a day looking at PredictWind offshore to identify a possible weather opening, plus another 30 minutes once we identified that opening to develop a tentative timetable that optimizes the forecast weather opening. The next or third step is to integrate the local weather forecasts which have been reviewed by local meteorologists with knowledge of the area. This would be NOAA's National Weather Service. If we were in Canadian waters, we would use Environment Canada. The NOAA forecast goes out 5 days, and Canadian weather only looks out 3 days. It is interesting to see that on Saturday afternoon, about 15 hours before our departure from Icy Straits, NOAA is forecasting east-northeast winds of 25 knots and 5-foot seas. So as a sort of sanity check, we can now start looking at local weather buoys which provide live, real-time weather. This is not a forecast, but an actual measurement of current conditions. The weather buoy off Icy Straits is telling a very different story than the current NOAA forecast. Actual conditions are showing only 4 to 6 knots of wind and 2.6 foot seas at 16 seconds. Nothing replaces having boots on the ground. By being on scene at least 24 hours before your scheduled departure, you can actually look out your window and get a good feel for the weather. We suspect that NOAA is seeing the possibility of winds developing, so being conservative, they are forecasting worst-case conditions. If these conditions materialize overnight, then when we are due to depart the following morning, we can always reevaluate and change our plan. When it comes to weather, especially at these latitudes, you have to stay flexible and play the cards you are dealt. The takeaway is that when it comes to weather and safety, we always have to remain disciplined and flexible. Well, when it comes to weather and offshore passage making, you will do yourself a great service by replacing the word plans with intentions. We have reversed course many times, and it was never the wrong call. Conversely, I can think of several times when I considered turning around and didn't. Many of those were the wrong call. To underscore this point, I'll share with you that just 2 weeks ago, prior to this coming weekend's crossing, we moved Oasis 100 miles from Juneau to the western edge of Icy Straits for what looked like a good opening. 12 hours before departure, we changed our mind, pulled the plug, and returned to Juneau. Welcome to passage making. You will want to be as heavy and low in the water as possible. That means full fuel and water tanks. And we depart on every offshore passage with all tanks fully pressed. So in conclusion, after waiting 6 weeks for a good weather opening, and with the last-minute change in the forecast winds off Kayak Island for light winds, we ended up deciding to take advantage of this weather opening. We woke up on Sunday morning with light winds in Icy Straits and the offshore buoy report showing equally light winds, low swells, and no change in the forecast. We left Icy Straits at 6 in the morning and we arrived in Prince William Sound 37 hours later. It was absolutely a perfect trip, ideal conditions, and well worth the wait. Here were our observations and average speeds at 8-hour intervals along our route. You will see that we were fighting a slight current at our departure and at our arrival time, but had the Alaskan current going with us for the rest of the trip. The net result was we ended up averaging just about our rated speed of 9.2 or 9.3 knots for the trip. You will need to have a routine in place to monitor weather to ensure that nothing has changed while you are en route. If you have cellular or satellite internet, then this is a relatively straightforward way to get weather. If not, you can monitor VHF radio weather, which is updated several times a day. That begs the following questions. First, how do I know what VHF or single sideband channel to listen to? Second, how can I see in advance which weather broadcast covers my specific area? Third, when are these forecasts typically released? Next, how can I familiarize myself with the local geographic references so I can follow along with the forecast? Is there a way to capture or record these forecasts so I can play it again? If I'm out of range, can I use a cell or sat phone to call for an updated weather forecast or buoy report? What number do I dial? What is the best designator to reference to get the broadcast that I'm interested in hearing? The answer to these questions are mostly found on what used to be called the NOAA's MSC Marine Service Charts, which are area maps divided up around the United States into 16 separate maps. Unfortunately, these maps have been discontinued, but in checking for this episode, you can still find them in PDF format online. If you are going to use these MSC charts, you should go through and proof them to check for any changes in phone numbers or station identifiers and make sure you note those changes on your chart. For our example, we're going to look at the Alaskan chart, also known as MSC number 15. I've marked our intended route on the chart in red. We are transiting 4 areas: PKZ 043, PKZ 051, PKZ 052, and PKZ 120, which are all covered by 3 radio broadcast stations shown with a red circle at Cape Edgecombe, Yakutat, and Cordova. There are also 3 offshore weather buoys along our route. One at Cape Spencer, buoy number 46083, Yakutat, buoy number 46082, and off Cape Hinchinbrook, buoy number 46061. If you are unfamiliar with the geographic names in a particular cruising area, these charts clearly display the names, which is super helpful in terms of identifying the locations referenced in the forecast broadcast and to keep you oriented. Here is an example of a NOAA VHF broadcast from Station Yakutat.
In the upper Cape decision to Cape Edgecombe, issued at 3:34 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time, Saturday, April 17th, 2021. For tonight, east wind 10 knots increasing to 20 knots. Seas 4 feet. Marine forecast for Cape Edgecombe to Cape Fairweather, issued at 3:34 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time, Saturday, April 17th, 2021. Small craft advisory late tonight. Marine forecast for Cape Fairweather to Arctic Cape, issued at 3:34 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time, Saturday, April 17th, 2021.
In the box located in the top left corner, they list approximate update times for weather broadcasts and buoy reports at each location. So if you are heading out of icy straits, how do you know which weather channel to switch to in order to find Yakutat's weather broadcast? Flip the chart over, and on the back side, located in the center right, you will see a box listing every weather broadcast station in Alaska in alphabetical order by its location's name. At the bottom of the first column, you'll see Yakutat. Its station locator identification is WXK69, and the frequency it broadcasts on is 162.40 megahertz. Conveniently, just to the right of this column, you will see a listing of the VHF weather channels number 1 through number 7 and their associated VHF marine weather radio frequency. You will also find on the back of these charts other useful information, like which MSC chart to use for each geographic area, information on how to reach Dial-a-Buoy by phone, AM and FM weather radio stations, high-frequency single sideband weather frequencies, times of broadcasts, and the areas covered. You will also find information on Navtex, along with a complete explanation of the definitions of small craft advisory, gale warning, storm warning, hurricane force wind warnings, and special marine warnings. These maps are chock full of valuable information, all consolidated in a single chart. To save time, we have the specific MSC chart for our cruising area under plexiglass on our navigation table, where we have inked in the VHF weather channel that corresponds to each broadcast station. Two final thoughts on VHF weather broadcasts. First, we have found that often the information is difficult to hear, comprehend, and process, especially if we aren't experienced cruising in that region. So we use a simple voice recorder or our telephone to record the broadcast, and/or we use a pre-prepared weather form where we can jot down in shorthand the upcoming forecast times, wind direction, wind speeds, and sea heights. Often when cruising in remote areas, we are at or beyond the practical limits of the particular weather station's broadcast range. We might have to listen to the same forecast multiple times in order to piece together the information we are looking for. Recording these voice broadcasts and/or taking notes can prove invaluable, especially if the weather is changing. Secondly, how do you know what the practical geographic range or limits are for being able to receive each of these VHF weather broadcasts, also known as radio propagation? Easy. NOAA publishes this information in a variety of forms and will even let you know if the transmitter status is normal, degraded, or out of service. This is what they look like. They also provide you with the frequency, call sign, location of the transmitter, a visual picture of the transmitter's radio propagation, and operating status. You can also view these transmitters by satellite image and overlay it on your route, as we have shown here for Icy Straits, Yakutat, and Cordova. Keep in mind that the green area represents the conservative range in all directions of each individual radio tower. So if you compare all three transmitters we will be listening to over the course of our 350-mile passage, you will see that for most of our trip, we will be considered out of range. Although technically this may well be the case, I can tell you from practical experience that we have picked up VHF weather radio broadcasts from as far off as 100 miles. The broadcasts may not be super clear or easy to understand, but we can usually get the information we are looking for by the second or third time we pick up that reception from that station. If not, and we are unsure if conditions have changed, we can always pick up the next broadcast by using a satellite phone and calling for a pre-recorded weather or Dial-a-Buoy report. Sometimes we even mark the limits of a station's propagation with a small notation on our navigation chart, just to remind us to be sure to pick up the latest forecast before we move out of the area. To wrap up this episode, I want to acknowledge that there are many different and equally effective ways to look at weather, with the only wrong way being not to look at all. Our way has worked well for us, but every captain I know seems to have their own favorite way to study and prepare for the weather along their passage. This episode is intended for those who may never have been exposed to offshore travel or long-range weather routing, and is only as a starting point and to show you a few examples of what is out there and how to work with it. The rest is up to you. Like with most skills, the more you practice, the better you will become. This is the essential and unglamorous side of what goes on behind the scenes that underscores what it means to be a professional, competent, and responsible ship's captain. The captains of the Alaskan fishing fleet are amongst the best in the world. They are fearless, experienced, battle-hardened, and their boats are built for working and surviving in the treacherous waters of the Bering Sea while continuing to fish in 70-mile-an-hour winds and 30-foot seas. In the last 30 years, 460 of these brave souls and over 100 boats left port and never returned. They now lie at the bottom of the Alaskan Ocean. This story is repeated in just about every coastal city in the United States and around the world. When you find yourself riding your motorcycle without a helmet, it's time to sell your bike. And when you stop seeing the threat or taking it seriously of putting to sea, it's time to stop boating. Here are my 8 takeaways from this episode. First, as captain or first mate, you are entrusted with the primary responsibility for the safety of your crew and ship. 2, as captain, you don't have the luxury of complacency or skipping steps when it comes to your vessel's preparedness, crew training, planning, and weather routing. 3, trust your feelings, even if you can't explain them. If you think it is time to reef, then reef. Nobody will ever fault you for being too cautious or conservative. 4, remember to assume that the wind and sea state predictions are 33% understated. Nadine and countless other ships wouldn't be at the bottom of the ocean if they had adhered to this formula. 5, fear is a much stronger emotion than elation, and 20 good experiences will not erase one bad experience. 6, don't let ego, false pride, rigidity, impatience, arrogance, overcommitments, intimidation, or fear influence your decisions. 7, do not consider your trip a plan until 2 hours before departure. As a friend of mine and former Air Force pilot used to say, indecision is the mother of flexibility. 8, conversely, as an experienced sailor, especially on the West Coast, you also never want to let good weather go to waste. So that pretty much concludes this episode, except for a brief discussion on what's coming up in part 2 of episode 2, which will cover the basic checklists of what is involved in making sure your boat is safe and prepared for an offshore passage. We're going to start with work that can be done well in advance of an extended offshore passage, including such items as any routine maintenance, testing, inspections, inventory preparedness, safety and abandoned ship preparations, bridge and navigation preparedness and testing, medical supplies, schematic drawings for diagnostics, pre-departure checklists, standing day and night orders, watch standing training, safety briefings, clothing, insurance, and more. We're going to finish the episode with the final pre-departure checklists, which are typically performed within 24 hours of getting underway. And those are going to include a final review of systems, ensuring all items are stowed and secured, final test of all bridge electronics, pre-start checklist for engines and generators, and final review with your crew. Then back to episode 3, we're going to return to cruising, picking up where we left off in the Pacific Northwest and cruising up the inside passage of British Columbia to Juneau, Alaska. Episode 4 will go from Juneau through Glacier Bay, across the Gulf of Alaska to Prince William Sound, with a brief trip down the Kenai Peninsula to Kodiak Island and the Alaskan Peninsula. So we certainly hope that you've enjoyed and or found this video useful. If so, please hit the subscribe button below. And once again, thank you for taking the time to join us here today. And we should be back to you with episode 2, part 2, in another couple of months. All the best. Thanks again. Bye now.